All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another webinar in the Reading Breath webinar series. And the topic today is on heat tolerance ABV. My co-host today is Trevor Parrish from Kangaroo Valley in New South Wales. Trevor, can you please tell us about your herd? How many cows are you milking and what your calving patterns are like?
All right, so we're a brief description for us for Kangaroo Valley is about 100 in a straight line, it's about 105 k's from the middle of Sydney, which is a bit surprising for most people, but it takes us probably an hour and a half, a bit over that, to get to Sydney now. We've got a lot of bush between us and them. We're presently milking nearly 260. We calve year round. There's no particular time of milk of calving. We've tried that, but we find we probably batch calve heifers about 3 to 4 times a year. But we're probably chasing genetics, so any of the new bulls coming along, we'll be using them and just trying to get in calves. Saying that, 260 is the most we've ever milked. A year and a half ago, we were milking 140. We'd sold a bunch of cows off, and the seasons weren't real good. It was still in the middle of drought, but we've managed to build the 260. We'd have about 130 heifers calve a year, and probably haven't bought any animals. I think probably in the last 5 years, we've probably bought 5 animals, but it would be 2 years ago since we've last put any animals into the herd from other studs, fully stud registered Holsteins. We've tested almost 1,000, I'd say, genomic testing for heifers and cows. I think some of them up to 4 generations of genomic tests. We also test for A2, although we don't sell to A2 milk, but we have a fairly large clientele of bull buyers that only want A2 bulls. And we milk in, as you can see, 20-side rapid release dairy with milk meters and conductivity. Yeah, so that's a quick sort of a brief. We're actually, feed-wise, we're mostly grass and just dairy pellets. Occasionally buy in hay, but we've just put in an irrigation system, so we'll probably, instead of buying the hay, we'll grow it.
Yeah. Thanks, Trevor. So in terms of the effect of heat on production on a warm day, you probably see this very clearly at your herd, Trevor.
Yeah.
Probably the first thing you see is the cow gonna eat less one day, and as a consequence, the milk yield is going down. So say in summer, do you see much difference between cows in terms of milk yield?
You definitely see difference between cows, and it's actually certain times of the day. Like if you get up in the morning, you go and milk the cows, and you can feel the heat coming along. And our area, we don't get a lot of breeze in here. Where we are in a valley, we're up one end of a valley, and the humidity is our major problem. Yes, we can get to plus 40, but usually when it's in the 40s, we've got just hot. And the cows, surprisingly, the straight hot days in 40 is probably not as bad as a day at 32 with high humidity. So we see them cows, certain cows will be under the trees straight away, but other cows quite happy to graze for a fair length of time longer. So, yeah. And it doesn't necessarily mean a white cow will be out. It could be a black cow. The colour type isn't quite as much as we expected it to be. So,
all right, that's a great information that you share. So, in terms of managing cows in hot and humid weather conditions, you have mentioned you have tree planted at your herd. In more control sort of system that people may install sprinklers or fan, but this seems to be quite impractical for a pasture-based open system like in Australia, don't we?
That's the problem. Like we've got our dairy actually extends out a bit further, so we've got shade in the dairy. That's mainly because for the shade, but it's also when we can get torrential raining. And so what it is we don't have sprinklers or fans, and we try and let the cows come up quickly, someone starts milking, and get them back to the paddock quickly. That's why we have a 20-side rapid release. We sort of don't want them staying around the dairy and sort of that. We've attempted to put in more shed above them, but we'd prefer the cows to shed in the paddock, not in the dairy, put it that way.
Yeah, and what do you think about having reading like the ABV for heat tolerance in your toolkits now?
Well, it's one of those things where when it came out, we looked at it and went, yep, all right. Now, which ones are our good ones? Which ones are our bad ones? And it was quite ironic when you went on them hot days, you could actually see the cows. It was the ones that had the worst were the ones that were always in the shade. And you sort of went, all right, do we keep working with those cows along that line and try and breed a higher heat tolerance? And that's what we've done is got a basket of bulls and we always try and keep them above a certain level. Sometimes the bulls we use just can't quite get to that level of 100, but we try and, I think it was 2 years ago, we set 96 and then we moved to 98 and we've been able to get over 100s for a while, but there's not a lot of bulls that high.
Thanks, Trevor. So, as I mentioned before, Trevor also observed the difference in cows in terms of tolerance to heat stress at farms. Say there's two cows, cow A and cow B, and on the horizontal axis is a temperature and humidity. Under a condition where cows are comfortable, they produce similar amount of milk. And when temperature and humidity increase to a certain level, but still in their comfort zone, they still produce the same amount of milk. However, when temperature and humidity sort of increase a bit further, cow A decline a bit of milk and cow B decline a lot more. And that rate of decline in milk production as temperature and humidity increase, we call it heat tolerance in this context. And in this case, we call cow A actually tolerates heat better than cow B. And the variabilities in dose slope that I mentioned earlier, or the rates of decline, 12% of it is attributed to genetics, and the rest are environment and management. So variations in heat tolerance actually exist, and therefore we can exploit in our breeding program. Heat tolerance ABV we released in December 2017 was standardized to an average of 100. And if a bull or cow have a heat tolerance ABV less than 100, mean that bulls or cows are below the average. And on the other side is better tolerance than the average. And the standard deviation was set to 5%. So we suggest that to choose heat tolerance bull, try to use the Good Bulls app or Good Bulls guide with a minimum of 100. As Trevor said, you don't have many bulls in your selection that have above 100. It's over here. As I have a filter this morning, that minimum 100, you have about 302 matching bulls that satisfy this condition. So the first filter for you probably consider BBI, depends on what you want to breed for. And the second filter will be on heat tolerance ABV of above 100.
Very good.
Yeah.
Yeah, we also, with the A2, makes it a little bit harder to get them bulls as well. So you sort of look at it, but there is actually a bit of an upswing in heat tolerance bulls from a couple of overseas bulls I've noticed with good ratings, and they'll have sons coming through the system as well. So yeah.
And also if the same set of bulls that have a similar BBI, some bulls actually better tolerance than others. For example, in the screenshot here, I have bull A, B, and C. all three have BBIs of 333, but Bull B actually have heat tolerance of 106. And if you have choice, probably this is a choice that you would get for if your herd is in a warm climate area. And in your setup, do you see many at all? You said that with the A2 on top of it, it become more difficult.
Yeah, there is a few bulls that I'd probably missed, and I thought, well, I'll use a sun. Well, sometimes they don't always throw good suns. So, but yeah, it's a sort of a. I try and use a number of bulls, not the highest for heat tolerance, or they've got a whole variety of things what I want to use. So we also been looking at milking temperament, milking speed, and mastitis resistance. And when you put them all together, you'll find the bulls, but it's sort of straight out. You're looking, thinking, oh, there's not going to be many, but there's a few more than I expect sometimes.
Yeah. When we select for heat tolerance, because we chose the rate of decline of milk yield, the decline in milk yield, the rate of decline in milk yield following the temperature and humidity, we obviously have unfavorable side effect with production. But on the other hand, we actually have a favorable relationship with fertility. Do you observe that in your bull selection, Trevor?
Yes and no. I was sort of saying there's a few bulls coming into the system that have quite, it's a specific line that I've found that seem to be having they still have a high production ASI. So, but it's usually a correlation, yes, but there is individuals out there that do both. So, they're the ones I'm looking for, outliers that can do all those things, but then I'm probably not getting the fertility as much as the production I probably wanted. So, yeah.
Yes.
So I'll look at them and find them and use them. And in the last run, we had heifers up to 107 on heat tolerance, which was well above the parent average. So I'm sort of think I'm heading in the right direction. We're getting better numbers. So yes.
Oh, that's great. That's really great to hear.
Yeah.
Do you use the Good Bulls app and data that much?
I do use it occasionally, but some of the bulls I use are just coming into the country, and sometimes they're not actually registered straight away with ADHIS. So they're not always on there. So yeah. So, but I can use it. It's pretty good to use because it gives you all those bulls straight up, and then you've got to make sure that some bulls that mightn't be on the system yet, you've got to check them out as well.
That's fair enough. Yep. And for extension resources on the topic, you can find it on the DataGene website. We have fact sheets and take notes for not just heat tolerance, but other traits as well. So they're also fact sheets is more for quick read, and take notes are more sort of for reading enthusiasts and backgrounders. A lot of technical details in that. I don't know whether
they're very good to actually get them through. You pick through them and go, yes, that's. And there's a few things like reliability. Some people just look at the straight out figure you're looking at and think that's. But if you haven't got the reliability in some of the things, it's going to take a little bit longer to get, and you don't quite get the results. You could get higher and lower, but the tech notes give you a fair feedback on that sort of stuff.
And we welcome any comment, suggestion to improve this material over time as well. Thank you, Trevor. Last but not least, I'd like to acknowledge contribution from Dairy Bio, where most of the, and Agriculture Victoria and Gardener Foundations, where most of the research come from. And also a huge thanks to data suppliers. Without data, we can't have breeding value. All the farmers out there that herd test and breeding organizations, wool companies, herd test center and software provider, and Trevor for your time today. Trevor and I welcome any question you might have in the audience?
Just a comment, Tui. Thank you for the presentation. Just a comment, and you can probably explain that your work, because you're actually the chief researcher that worked on this project with Professor Jenny Price, but the work was actually done here locally, wasn't it? It was work that you did through Allen Bank and collecting a lot of data across Australia, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. We try to use all Australian data, of course, with filters. At the time, we use a minimum of 4 records per year, and over a 16 years period, we align the genotype, 50,000 SNPs, with the phenotype, which is the slope that I described before, and come up with a prediction equation. The breeding value has an accuracy, reliability of 38%. For a trait like heat tolerance, it's brand new. It's great, but it's still relatively low, in like moderate to low in terms of reliabilities. And we decide to step a bit further to validate those breeding value before we release to the public. And to do that, we genotype 400 heifers. I predicted the heat tolerance ABV. We sent to Allen Bank with the list, and they chose the top 24 and the bottom 24. Later on, we know that these bottom 24 and top 24 in the 400 are actually different in about 2 standard deviations in GEBV. And we challenged the animal in a controlled climate chambers, and the pattern came out agree with what predicted. So what we predict to be heat tolerance become more tolerance, and what we predicted to be susceptible become susceptible to heat tolerance. Thanks, Pete.
I've got a question, actually, if there's any bull companies in the audience. Trevor said that by the time he sort of looks at his various breeding priorities and filters, he's got a relatively short list of good high heat tolerance bulls, but that there are sort of more ones coming along. I just wondered if any of the bull companies could give us any sort of insights on how the choice has improved over time.
Did you want me to start there?
Sure.
I think from an ABS point of view, it is still very tricky because Australia is really the only one that's focused on heat tolerance. So you're pretty, I mean, from our point of view, unless we've got some bulls coming from Australia, we're very reliant on what our product development teams do around the world, and they actually don't have that information at hand. So until they're actually selected and brought into the bull programs overseas, that's when we get the information from here. So it's kind of almost by chance that some of the bulls do rank higher because there's no selection process from overseas on any of those bulls. So unless it's a local bull that we're pursuing. So I hope that kind of helped answer it a little bit.
Yep.
Yep.
And just to add to that, Bruce, it was interesting last year when we were actually in China, in Mongolia, where they do have heat and they do have humidity. What they were finding was their traditional ways of handling it were failing. So they reached a point where the fans, the sprays, the shade, everything like that was reaching a point where they'd run out of extra guesses. So they were very interested in a genetic solution to actually make cows. And what you find, Trevor, too, isn't it, being a low to medium heritability, is that if you keep doing it generation after generation, you actually make gains. You were saying you're up around 106, 108, you know, on some heifers now. Yeah, well, it's noticeable, the gains when I look at, because I focused on it as well, like I wasn't using bulls that were going to be a minus. But it's one of those things when you're using it, you sort of go, oh, there's a high BPI bull, but he's 88 for heat tolerance. I go, well, I'm only going to be going backwards there because in the middle of summer when we get a downpour of rain, them sort of cows are the ones we found
we thought were in calf, but at 88 they can slip the calf or not conceive. So that's why we're focusing on lifting it. Older generation bulls like Showtime and Shawma, they were 110, 112, 113. So that's 2 standard deviation points above 100. So them bulls probably could have handled it a fair bit. Daughters could have handled it a fair bit more. So. Yeah.
And you've also got that market, haven't you, for bulls that you sell? You mentioned that you've got bulls that you sell to other dairymen or farmers, and you're actually taking the responsibility to try and make them as heat tolerant as you can.
That's right. We also in a breeding group with Genetics Australia called the Nucleus Group, and one of the things GA has been after is more bulls they could possibly send to China for them same reasons you were saying, Peter, about the heat tolerance over there. So it's a marketing thing. And I know that if a bull's going to be at 102 compared to 90, he's got more chance of going to A-high than the lower end bulls. So, and a bull like that's worth good money to us. So, yeah.
Pete, on the export heifer side, are you aware of any importer actually looking for heat tolerance before they chose the cows?
At the moment, TUI not, because they generally don't get a genomic test on the heifer, but there was certainly significant interest in amongst some groups in China to go to that extra step and either get heifers from heat tolerant bulls or to genomic test themselves. So there was a lot of interest because they had run out of other options, that they've reached the ceiling on handling heat tolerance through those other means. So they were really interested in a genetic method solution.
So I have a question for somebody from one of the genomic service providers. When your clients are looking at results, do they take much notice of heat tolerance?
I would have thought it's more Northern Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland. So just a look at the spread of farmers that genomically test their heifers. Vast majority wouldn't be in that area. It's hard to say, but based on the distribution of northern versus southern farmers, it's testing. There wouldn't be any definitive answer without actually asking them individually. Sorry, that's a bit vague, that answer, but that's about where it sits.
I think it's quite a varied selection criteria at a producer level, with the index being fairly heavy in selection criteria. I wouldn't say it's a significant selection item at this point, and there is geographic variation for sure.
Yeah.
Just on that variation too, Daniel, it was interesting, and Tui might want to comment as well, is that even the areas that don't suffer from prolonged heat like Trevor and humidity, if they do have an event, so they do have a heat event like a heat wave, even if you're in one of those cooler climates, if you have a heat event, that event can actually affect the production of that cow across the remaining of her lactation. So it's not just the days that she suffers from heat, it's actually can be an ongoing effect too, can't it?
Yeah, that's right. And also for these cows take longer to recover as well.
In this area here, like we are in Kangaroo Valley, but there's some of the guys along the coastal fringe at Nowra, they get a sea breeze most days. And I think it was a year and would have been just over a year ago, they had, it was in summertime and they didn't get their usual sea breeze. So it wasn't 40 degrees. It was only in the high 30s, but their farmers are not used to getting that much heat, and they just suffers quite a bit of low fertility in the cows, and there was a long-term effect on a fair few of the herds. So, but they were only a distance from 5 k's from the coast, and moved them inland, and the other guys are used to that sort of heat, but these other guys weren't quite used to it, and there was a fair bit of thing with the vets talking about it too. Yeah.
When I was at Coprice, stock feeds, there was an additive we used to be able to add to the ration that would help the cows handle the heat a little bit better. It'd still be effective, but they'd bounce back a lot quicker. I can't remember what it was called, but I was in Western Victoria, and despite what I said earlier about being north of northern Victoria, but it certainly did hit in Western Victoria. But it'd only be about a week to 10 days once a year, and as soon as it hit, we get some phone calls from our dairy clients saying, please add it to the ration.
There's a fair bit of research going on in Ellenbank at the moment on the diet to control his stress as well.
And if we look to the future, Tui, the predictions are that we will get incrementally hotter. So part of our breeding strategy to the future is not so much what will happen tomorrow, but what's going to happen in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And if heat becomes more of an issue, I think something like heat tolerance will start to become quite a prominent selection.
Yeah, that's a good point, Pete.
Stephanie has a question.
Steph, you have a question?
Oh, yes. I was
Sorry.
like, it's probably a dumb question, so I'll turn my camera off and sit down and be quiet. Tui, I was just really interested in the negative correlation between heat tolerance and milk production. And I thought about how I would ask the question in a way that it would make sense. But if you had cow A and cow B, the examples that you gave, obviously in a temperate region, cow A or the cow with the lower heat tolerance would produce better. But if you put both those cows into a hot environment, is the heat tolerance enough to offset the negative production with that? Or is it just that the difference in production drop is smaller? And in fact, the higher producing lower heat tolerant cow still has enough of a difference to make up for it, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's sort of quite a tricky question to explain as well. So Pete's terminology is really good at having analogy. It's more like two racing cars, and when the other car, the cow A to put the brake and cow B to accelerate, and that's a different environment, in an extremely hot condition. But depend on how much the cow B decline as well. If it's decline a lot, then cow A probably not become so disadvantaged. But otherwise, at the moment, it would be ideal to blend that into an index so that you know whether B and A can compensate or some sort of can compare the two in a certain environment. But at the moment, it's tricky because it's standalone. And I guess if as Pete said, in the future, it become more important and farmers are keen to build into an index and it will be a better. So we standardize everything into a dollar term and that would be better
that would answer the
see
question.
A and B would be distinguished better. Yeah. Thanks, Steph.
That makes sense. Yeah, thank you, Tui.
Yeah.
And in real life, Trevor, how does it pan out?
Well, I would have liked to have some of them older cows that would buy some of them higher heat tolerance bulls from years ago around, but I've been focusing on BPI, so a lot of those older genetic cows that probably had a reasonable heat tolerance have gone. We do have, as I said, it's up to 107, but they're under the youngest stock. I haven't actually looked at of the older cows that I did get rid of, what their heat tolerance may have been, but yeah, it's sort of. But as I said, nowadays I think there's a correlation there with the production loss, but there is individual bulls that will give you the production anyway. So I'm seeing that there's a particular line from a CMEX bull that's throwing up 102s and 103 sons, so heat tolerance. So he's a production bull. So.
And it would be very similar, Trev, to where we were when we first introduced daughter fertility, that yes. it had a negative correlation to production. And we thought, what are we doing introducing a trait that'll actually bring back production? But the interesting part was when we put the two together, we actually found the bulls that did both. And we focused on those, and we've actually got over that fertility now. I think heat tolerance will be the same, that what you do is perfect in that you put the two together and you take the bull that's got the best combination of both.
Yeah.
That's the focus. That's what I'm trying to grab them bulls that do a lot. I call them outliers. They just sort of do a lot more things.
Yeah. Any more questions, comments?
Yes, excuse me, it's Paul Quinlan, Worldwide Size.
Hi,
A couple
Paul.
of comments. One's just a general comment, and the other one's probably an advertorial. With the heat tolerance, you've got 13% genetic, 18% environment and management. Excuse me. There are, management tools out there, and Worldwide Size are offering a cow manager system that I think is a bit unique in that it does monitor the temperature of the animals in the ear versus other, or amongst other things, it can actually assist from the management side of things. And given that it's 87% environment and management, we, along with the genetics that Trevor's obviously taking on, there are tools that can actually assist further as well.
Yep. And part of it also the diet, if we have a diet that helps to cool the cows down during the hot days. Thanks, Paul. Any other comments, questions?
I think just a comment too, Tui, is that the work that you did and Jenny did to actually link it to genomics means that even if somebody tests an animal genomically, the prediction is we can link it through the genes. So we can actually make a prediction on young animals, even though they haven't been subject to heat yet. And in their lifetime, we can link it through genomics, which is very powerful, isn't it?
Yeah, that's correct, Pete.
And we've seen quite a few overseas bull companies actually screening bulls through Australia, Trev, where they actually genotype bulls here. And the heat tolerance breeding value is something they take into other countries. So they actually use our assessment here to then move into other countries as a positive way of selecting their bulls for those hot, humid countries.
Just on that, Peter, yeah, that's so a lot of our South American countries are now using the Australian heat tolerance value to select some of the bulls that they're putting into South America. So yes, that is every time proof run comes through, that's one of the first files that has to go off. So
that's
pretty exciting, actually.
Yeah, and same as India.
Before we go, I'd just like to thank everyone for dialing in and everybody who's contributed comments, because for those of us organising it, it's much more rewarding when we've got some interaction and discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Leanne.
Thanks for inviting me as a co-host.
Back out to the heat now, Trev.
No, it's Thursday, so I think I got my milker this afternoon, so I'm quite organised actually for once.
You could stay in the air conditioning.